Can a Jewish community surrender one of its own to save the many? This class explores 3 cases from the 1600s and the 1700s where this wrenching question was brought before leading rabbanim. We'll learn about the details of each case, the rulings the rabbis issued, and the Talmudic sources that shaped their decisions. Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, otherwise known as the Bach. The Bach is the name of his Sefer, Bayis Chadash. It's a commentary on the Torah. He lived in the 1500s and the 1600s. He passed away around the year 1640. And he tells us in his Chuvas, Siman Mem Gimel, he tells us the following story. This is a story that he is involved in because the Shaila comes to him. Al dvar alilois sheker, with respect to a libel, which means there's an accusation made against Jews, but it's based in falsehood. Shehelilu be'ir Kalish, this occurred in the city of Kalish, Polish city. Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, the Bach, was in Krakow at this time. We know the date of this story because he actually signs off his tshuva the year Shin Pei, so it's the year 1630. So Krakow is, I guess, it's in the general vicinity of where Kalisz is in Poland. It's a few hundred kilometers away. And 1620, yes, that is correct. Not 1630, 1620. Sorry about that. Anyway, She'elilu be'ir Kalish al Yehudi echad, on a Jew, bidvar goyal shalehem, about their goyal. Goyal here means, in this context, it means mios, it means disgusting, it means unclean. And the language here is vague, but it could mean one of 2 things. One is there was an accusation that used to go around during the 1400s, we see it, the 1500s, and I guess here as well, that Jewish people would like to steal the bread that was used in a Catholic religious service, which has very important meaning for them. And that just like Jews killed the original founder, the accusation went, and just as the blood libel says that they continue doing that to Christian citizens or children, so a second cousin of these accusations was that they do it to this bread, which is meant to represent the body of their founder. So this is often called, in English, it's called host desecration. So that's probably what it means. It's also a possibility that it was an accusation that he stole some sort of statue or statuette. That's also a possibility. Vitfasuhu, utafsuhu, and they caught this individual. Uvishah shahoy lichuhu, and now they're taking him to prison. Lakach kisoy, so this Yid takes his purse, Umsaru libnei bris, and he gives it to fellow Jews. Like on the way, as the police are taking him out, he hands his purse over to Jews. Because there were a few Jews amongst the many non-Jews who were with him when he was being taken. These are very important words, not from a halachic perspective, from a historical perspective. What you're seeing over here is there's a little bit of a mob that's going on. This is not a quiet arrest where 2 cops come to someone and take him away. There's a mob that is angry because a Jew has done this terrible thing, this type of desecration. He's being incarcerated, but they're being accompanied with this mob. There's some Jews who are there. He takes his purse, he hands it to the Jews, and v'hayu sham chamav v'gisai. And amongst the people who were there was his father-in-law and his brother-in-law. And now, la'achar shekidish es Hashem, he already did Kiddush Hashem. So in other words, we already know the end of his story. The end of his story ends in tragedy. What does it mean he did Kiddush Hashem? Remember, the whole story never happened. He never stole any. The Bach is very, very clear. This was on Alila. So what does that mean? They took him. They tortured him. He confessed to the crime. That was the evidence. Now what? You can save yourself if you convert. He didn't do that. And so he's killed, and so that death is Kiddush Hashem, because he could have easily saved, not easily, but he could have saved himself by converting to Christianity. So that's the end of that story, a real tragedy, and we would not have known about this story if not for the continuation. What's the continuation? After the fact that he did Kiddush Hashem, so these false accusers came back, litfoyas hakol, and now they're making a claim against the Jewish community, betaina, saying shechamav, that his father-in-law, remember, his father-in-law was in the crowd, he was amongst the Jews, who took the purse. So chamav shu shamish shel hakol, the father-in-law who has a prestigious office in the community, he's a shamish, had many different responsibilities. Lakach hakis miyad hanitfas, they're saying he's the one who took it. Uvikis haya agoya. And now they didn't chap then. Now they're saying, now the Christians are saying that the consecrated object was in that little purse. So pasku hasar and b'chatzar melech. So the ministers that were in the king's court, the king of Poland at the time was Sigmund III. And so his ministers said, "Sha'arashim," that the leaders of the Jewish community, "Mechuyavim lahamed es hashamish lemishpat b'fnei ha-voivode." So they basically go to the Jewish community leaders. They say, "You need to turn over this shamish, and you need to bring him to the voivode." Voivode is still an office that's still in Polish government. It means regional representatives of the king, broken down by region in Poland. That basically he needs to show up there. V'im lo yamidu lemishpat. If you're not going to turn him over, if you're not going to turn him over, then basically any punishment the king is going to want, instead of giving it to this person who's not here, he's going to give it to you guys. That's the type of blackmail that the Jewish community is facing. The shamish there, where is the shamish? Kfar Barach Malat, he ran away. Presumably it means he's not in Kalish anymore. He's in another city. V'nitman etel Yehudi echad, and he's hiding by a Jew. If we're taka gonna go and hand him over, we have to be afraid. Maybe they're gonna torture him, which even goes against their own laws. So officially, they're not supposed to be doing torture, even in Poland in the 1600s by the secular law, or the whatever law they were using at the time. They were not supposed to be doing torture. But the reality is, we need to be afraid that they're going to. In fact, we see already that they're acting in unusual ways, or they're not following their own laws, because this whole blackmail saying, if you don't turn them over, then we're going to punish you, that's not on the books in Polish law. That's not something they have a right to do, and yet they're doing it. So we see that they're basically determined to do whatever they want, however they want. We turn him over, he's going to be tortured. We know he didn't do anything. And what's it going to lead to? I mean, it's very high chance he's going to be killed. There's also the threat that maybe he caves in, maybe he converts, God forbid. So do we have a right to hand him over? This is the question. Ma din ha'ish ha'laz. What is the din with this person? In yesh heter lahamidu lemishpatim lav. Is there permission to turn him and give him over to the authorities? This is the question that comes to the Bach, again in the year 1620. Okay, before we go to see what the Bach responded, just want to tell you briefly that when the first printing of the Tshuvas of the Bach is in the late 1600s, 1697, so there you have this Tshuva there printed in that edition, and likewise in the modern editions as well. However, when this Sefer was printed in 1834 in Russia, this Siman was removed. So it goes straight from Siman Mem Beis, you finish reading Siman Mem Beis, and then it jumps to Siman Mem Dalet. I'm not sure why, 100% why it was removed. Remember, even maybe the words, even just referring to these objects as goyal, that itself could have been problematic. Or maybe the discussion, should we turn him over or not? What do you mean, should you? Of course you have to turn him over. So there are some sensitive issues that you have here in this Tshuva, which is why it would have been removed from the edition that appeared in 1834, which only makes us more interested in learning this Tshuva. So in order to address this, the Bach turns to a very famous sugya. It's the sugya that we have in Yerushalmi, Maseches Tumas, Perek Ches, where the Yerushalmi brings a brisa, a teaching from the Tanoim that says as follows: if you have caravans of people traveling, upago ben goyim, and non-Jews encounter them, va'amru, and they tell their Jewish caravans, Tna lanu echad mikem v'nare goysai, hand over one and we'll kill him. V'im lav, if you don't, hareinu hoyergim es kulchem, we will, God forbid, kill all of you. Says the Braisa, afilu kulon aragin, even if it's true. In other words, even if it's not an empty threat, even if it's a real threat that they're going to take everyone's lives, still, lo yimsru nefesh achas miyisrael, you do not have a right to hand over one to save the entire group. However, the Braisa continues and says, yichadu lahen echad. What if they named a person, they designated someone, they said, we want so-and-so, Kigoin, for example, like the story of Sheva ben Bichri, where we'll talk more about the story in a second, where in this story, something similar happens, and the person who's making the threat says, I want Sheva ben Bichri. So if they label one person, then Yimsuru, I say, then you're allowed to give him over Va'al Yeh Hargu, and the population, the larger group, should not allow themselves to be killed. This ends the teaching of the Tanoim. And what happens now is that in the Yerushalmi, we have the next layer, the layer of Amoraim, where they argue about the application of the Seifa. This heter, we just learned of a heter. There is a case where you're allowed to hand over one when he's labeled like Sheva ben Bichri. What does that mean? So this turns into a machlokes. Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish. So Rab Shimon ben Lakish says, V'hu sheyehei chayiv misa k'Sheva ben Bichri. It needs to be very similar to the story of Sheva ben Bichri, where again, we'll say the story in a second, but in Sheva ben Bichri, it's not just they labeled and they said, we want the guy also was chayiv misa. So really you need two things. You need a label, he needs to be labeled, and he needs to be chayiv misa. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not necessary. According to Reish Lakish, it's very understood why the language in the Brisa says, Yichadu lohen echad kigoin Sheva ben Bichri. I could have just said, Yichadu lohen echad, if they named one person. What do you need to give me a dugma, kigoin Sheva ben Bichri? So that may have been what was bothering Reish Lakish. Why do you need the dugma, kigoin Sheva ben Bichri? It's not enough that Yichadu lohen echad. It has to be an echad who is also guilty like Sheva ben Bichri. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Rabbi Yochanan does not accept that deal. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yichadu lohen echad, that's what you need. And it just wanted a biblical example. Where's a biblical example? It's a Maaseh Sheva ben Bichri. So what is this Maaseh Sheva ben Bichri? It's in Shmuel Beis, in Perek Chaf, where, Bekitzer, you have an individual by the name of Sheva ben Bichri who starts a revolt against David HaMelech, and he says, guys, we don't need David HaMelech, in Lanu Chelek with David, and basically, for all of Am Yisrael, except for Shevet Yehuda, is now an open rebellion against David HaMelech. David HaMelech sends Yoav to go quell this rebellion, and obviously that means you need to go get the leader. The leader is Sheva ben Bichri. He's hiding all the way north in Eretz Yisrael in a city called Ovel Beis Macha. Yoav comes, he surrounds the city, and he lays siege. Now, in the ancient world, laying siege means a lot of people are going to die. That's just the very nature of a siege, from the very fact that no one could go in and no one could get out, and how much more so if you're going to start throwing cannon fire and all these types of, or whatever equivalents they use in the ancient world, in order to attack a city. So people are going to die here. And so there's a woman who comes out and she says, I want to speak to Yoav. And she says, well, you're going to really destroy a Jewish city? So Yoav responds to this woman and says, Vayan Yoav hayomer, Chalila, Chalila li mavala v'imashkas. No, I didn't come here to destroy anything. Lo yichein hadavar. No, you misunderstand my intentions. Rather, this is what I want. Ki ish mehar Ephraim is in your city. Sheva ben Bichri shmoi. Nasa yada b'amelech b'David. He rebelled against David. Tznu oisei levade. Hand him over to me. Ve'ochamei alir. And then we'll leave. Now you can read this as implying, and if you don't hand him over to us, then we're not going to leave. And then there's going to be consequences. So in other words, this is essentially the dilemma that the Yerushalmi has of tznu lanu achas mikem, and if not, there's going to be consequences for the entire group. Well, what happened in that story? The woman essentially went and convinced the leaders of the city. They not only handed him over, they actually killed him, Sheva ben Bichri, and then handed over his corpse to Yoav. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying, all you need is that the group should say, we want Yankel. That's all. That's the only thing you need. Reish Lakish is saying, no. It's not enough. It has to be, we want Yankel, but Yankel really is Chayev Misa, like in the story of Sheva ben Bichri. This is the machlokes between these two great Amoraim. So what's going to be the Psak Din? What's going to be the Psak Din when you have this type of debate? So the Rambam addresses this in Nochis Yosei de HaTorah, Perek Hei Halacha Hei, where the Rambam brings the case, and he says, normally you're not allowed to hand over one to save another. However, im yichadu lahem v'amru, if they said, they labeled one person and they said, Tnu lanu ploini oinaregas kulchem, hand over this one or we'll kill everyone. So then, im haya mechuyav misa keshavam ben bichri, if indeed this person is chayav misa, so then yitnu oisai lahem. then you can hand him over. In other words, Rambam is paskening like Reish Lakish, like the stricter position, not like Rabbi Yochanan. This is interesting because the Bach in his tshuva brings this Rambam and says, it could have gone the other way. You could have gone paskening like Rabbi Yochanan. And in fact, generally speaking, the Gemara says clearly that whenever there's a machlekes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we always pasken like Rabbi Yochanan over Reish Lakish, which leads to an entire analysis on this Rambam and why the Rambam goes the other way. Though I should point out and say that there are other cases where the Rambam also, in a machlekes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, goes with Reish Lakish over Rabbi Yochanan. Each of these turns into a full discussion why he's doing that. We're not going to get into that. The bottom line is that although there are some Rishonim who either say clearly the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, or they imply the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, one of the things the Bach says is that if you bring the machlokes with no comment, then by definition it means you hold the psak din is like Rabbi Yochanan. Because everyone knows the Gemara, halacha is always like Rabbi Yochanan. So if you're going to just tell me, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said, this is what Reish Lakish said, and then you leave it at that, then by definition you're implying the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan. So he points out that some Rishonim are doing that. But at the end of the day, you have the Rambam. And the Bach, writing in the 1600s, is not going, the 1620, so the Bach is not going to ignore this Rambam, and so therefore the bottom line is going to be that we're going to take this stricter view, the view of Reish Lakish. Another reason to take this view, the Bach says, is because of the Rama. It's interesting, the Mechaber did not bring this issue in his Shulchan Aruch. That's interesting. The Rama added it in Shulchan Aruch Yeridei Kuf Nun Zayin, and let's read. He says, if non-Jews say, give over to us one. Interestingly, the Ramah doesn't finish the sentence over here. Doesn't say, and if not, we're going to kill everyone. But most people who read this assume that's what the Ramah means. Just for whatever reason, he left that part of the sentence out. So what's the din? Lo yitnu lahem echad mem. You're not allowed to hand over one. Elain kain. When are you allowed to do it? If they labeled one person, they say, we want Yankel, then you have the right to do it. But other than that, you don't have the right. So that's Rabbi Yochanan, right? But then the Ramah continues and says, some people say, even in such a case, don't hand them over, unless he is a chayiv misa kashava ben bichri. So here is Reish Lakish. He brings two positions. The Bach says an interesting rule. And this obviously gets into a discussion of klale hapsak that relates to the Ramah. It also relates to Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, brings two positions. So then the question is, which one's the psak? And the Ramah is doing that here. Which one's the psak? The Bach says that when the Ramah brings two positions, the second one is the psak. Okay, I'm not sure how he has that information, but he says it as a davar apashat. I know others discuss this. We're not going to we're not going to get into this. The bottom line is, this is another reason we're going to paskin like Reish Lakish. Again, we have the Rambam, we have the Ramah, and this is why we're paskening like Reish Lakish. So where does that leave us? So now let's go back to the tshuva of the Bach, and let's see how he applied this information to the case of this object that the Shamish is accused of having. Im ha-Yehudi, says the Bach, Shehu Shamish HaKol. If this Shamish, Kibel Yodei Akis Bifnei HaGoyim, if it is true that he received this purse, he's the father-in-law, if he received the purse in front of the non-Jewish crowd, then Vadai Amrina, we definitely say, because he is the one who caused the problem by accepting this purse in front of the non-Jews, which we would call today irresponsible. He's accepting something from a Jew who's being libeled as having done a terrible crime. And he didn't consider the possibility that this may lead to some accusation against him. If so, he himself is put himself in this danger. And therefore, we're allowed to hand them over in order to save the group. Even though maybe, God forbid, we don't know what's going to happen. There's a possibility he's going to go there, they'll ask him a few questions, they'll send him home. But there's also a possibility they're going to, God forbid, take his life, they're going to kill him. Still, we're allowed to do it. Why? They labeled him. They want one person. Number one. Number two, and by their laws, he needs to be handed over. So therefore, this is not our liability, it's his responsibility. So what's happening over here? There's something very important that's happening over here that we need to stress. You may have thought, when you read Reish Lakish and when you read the Rambam, that the person needs to be chayiv misa to be handed over means that the person did a crime that al pi Torah in a Jewish court is chayiv misa. I mean, if you wanted to add, you could say, and it was done in front of 2 witnesses and with hasra and like chayiv misa at the highest and strictest level. Well, clearly, what the Bach says is that that's not the case. Chayiv misa doesn't mean b'dinei Yisrael. Chayiv misa means b'dinei hagoyim. And so the key question, therefore, to ask is, did you do something that by their laws now demands that we do a certain thing? So if you did something, specifically, take this purse, and again, you're doing it in front of the non-Jews, so you made a choice. By their laws, such a person needs to be interrogated. So we now need to hand you over. And so therefore, although we have this stricter position, the position of Reish Lakish, he is ready to say that based on this, we can hand over this shamish to father-in-law in order to save the group who is being blackmailed. As we're going to go through this tshuva of the Bach, we're going to highlight 3 chidushim of the Bach. And that is, even though we have Reish Lakish, which is the stricter position, we're going to see the Bach is going to poke 3 holes into this shitta of Reish Lakish, thereby allowing for heter. One, and the first hole we already saw, chayiv misa does not mean chayiv misa b'dinei Yisrael. Chayiv misa just means, did the person do something that has triggered this non-Jewish request for someone to be arrested and whatever may follow as a result. That's his first chiddush. Now he continues, however, and he says, however, we need to overcome a problem over here. Before we can proceed, we need to overcome a problem. What's the problem? In the classic case, the way Reish Lakish framed the case is that you have these bandits. They surround a group of people, and they say, "Give us one. If not, we're going to kill everyone in the group." So now, imagine no one is handed over. What's going to happen? Every single person is dying over there. That's the case. Here, in our case, it's different. This guy fled Kalish. He's not surrounded by anyone. In fact, right now, he's maybe sipping a nice, comfortable drink sitting on the deck in the back of someone's house. He's mechutz l'sakana. So, does that difference matter? So, there are sources that actually say they do. Let's look at Rabbi Yitzchak Mikorbei. He's the Smak. He's one of the Rishonim writing in the 13th century, Sefer Mitzvahs Katan, and he writes, V'nira d'mayri, it seems to me that when are you allowed to hand over one to save the group? D'mayri shu b'sakoniman, if he's in the dangerous situation. So in other words, when we're handing him over, we could say, by the way, you're dying anyway. There's no difference. In other words, either everyone's dying with you, or you're dying alone, but you're dying anyway. But if he's not here, then you can't tell the guy you're dying anyway, then you're not allowed to hand him over. So that's a problem, because in our case, the shamish is actually not here. He's not part of the group. He's not in the sakana. So are we allowed to now hand him over? Says the Bach. Chiddush number 2. Although it is true that in this case, the shamish has already ran away. He disappeared. So now he's not in the sakana. And the smak paskin the be'inyan zeh asur l'moiser. Then in such a case, you're not allowed to hand the person over. So then he says, however, we need to clarify. The smak, he says, holds like Rabbi Yochanan. He's in that class of the Rishonim, hold like Rabbi Yochanan. If you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that you're allowed to hand over an innocent person who didn't do anything wrong just because he was labeled, then yes, it must be that the person is in the sakana. However, he says, we're not dealing here, we're working within the model of Rabbi Yochanan. We're working within Reish Lakish, there the rule is different. So let me explain what he means by that. Let's remember, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's a little bit of an odd thing, because you're handing an innocent person, the guy didn't do anything, and you're handing him over. So why are you handing him over? So the Bach tells us that Rabbi Yochanan tells you there's 2 reasons that justify, and you need to have both of them. Number 1 is, Yanko, we love you, but this is not our choice. You need to be able to say that. This is not our choice. So in other words, if it's hand over one, and now the Jewish community needs to select someone, oh, forget it. We can't do that. How are you going to select? Who are you going to select? Well, by what basis are you going to make that selection? Jewish community can't be involved in that business. But here, because you don't need to select anyone, they told you who they want, so fine. So Rabbi Yochanan is willing to have a conversation. However, there needs to be a second thing. And that is, as you're holding Yankele by the hand and you're taking him, and you're saying, we chose you because they asked for you, you also need to say something else. You're dying anyway. You're dying anyway. So then Rabbi Yochanan says that although the guy is innocent, but because you have those two things, number one, we're not choosing. Number two, you're dying anyway, then you can hand this person over. So that's the smak held like Rabbi Yochanan, that's why he said this. But now let's think about the philosophy behind Reish Lakish's view. Reish Lakish is coming at this from a whole other perspective. He's saying, you know why you're handing someone over? Because he was a jerk. He did something wrong. He behaved wrongly. He triggered the problem. So once that's the philosophy that justifies the handing over, so then you don't need these nekudas of we're not choosing, although that happens to be the case that you're not choosing, and you definitely don't need this other nekuda of the guy is ben kach going to be dying. No, we come to you, we say, why you? Because you triggered this whole mess. Finished. And so therefore, you don't need this detail that he's in the sakana, and so therefore, we would be able to even go outside of Kalish and to go to this other community and drag this person in, even though right now he's not under any threat. And so therefore, we have the second hole that the Bach drills into the Shitta of Reish Lakish. The first hole, again, was it doesn't need to be a Chi of Misa Midin Torah. The second hole is, even if he's outside of the Sakana, still we're going to hand him over to save the group. However, the Bach continues and says there's one other challenge before we reach this Maskana, and that brings us back to the Rambam. Because the Rambam has an added line that we didn't quote before. What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says, after he brings the Shitta to Reish Lakish, and after the Rambam says, we hand over only if the person is Chayiv Misa, the Rambam says the following 5 words. Vein moirin lahem kein lechatchila. We do not actually give this psak. This is a very unusual thing. Usually a psak is a psak. Here, on the one hand, we have a psak. The psak is, if the person was labeled and is Chayiv Misa, we can hand the person over. The Rambam says, but actually we shouldn't paskin. Where is this coming from? So the Mefarshim assume that Rambam is coming, and the Bach assumes that the Rambam is coming from the following Yerushalmi. It's the same sugya in Yerushalmi in Periches. Ula bar Koishev Tavate Malchusa. There was a man by the name of Ula bar Koishev. He lived during that generation of the end of the Tanoim, the beginning of the Amoraim, the generation of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, as we're going to see. And he lived in Eretz Yisrael, and the government was looking for him. Why was the government looking for him? It doesn't say. But Bepashtos, this is the way the Bach understands it, he did a crime against the Roman government. Arak also Lud, he ran to Lud, Gabi Yeshua ben Levi, he's hiding with in the area of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Also in Va'akfu Medinta, so the Roman legions came and they're surrounding Lud. Amru lahen, and they said to the Jews, Im leis asun yavun leilan, if you don't give him to us, anan mecharvin medinta, we will destroy the entire area. Salak Gabe Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi went to visit him. Upaisei, in other words, he convinced him with words that he should go out and hand himself over to the Romans. And this is the Yerushalmi in Bereishis Rabbah. It adds a few words here. He said, better you be killed than the entire community be killed. The Yahweh line, and they handed him over to the Romans. Usually Eliyahu would appear himself to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. However, now he stopped appearing himself to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi fasts a number of fasts, and then he encounters Eliyahu, and the following conversation goes on. Eliyahu says, do I come visit people who are Moisrim, who hand over people to the Gentiles to be killed like that? So he asks the question. A Jew answers a question with a question. Amalei v'loy Mishnah asisi. Didn't I follow what the Mishnah said? So the Rambam would learn this as follows. He was labeled, he's also Chayiv Misa by their dinim, because he did a crime against them. And so I followed exactly what Reish Lakish said, so what was the problem? Amar lei, you answer a question with a question. V'zu Mishnah Sachsidim. And is this I know it's a Mishnah, it's a Brisa, I know it's a teaching, and that's the halacha. But is that for Chassidim? So the Medrash, which again has the same story, adds a few words where the implication is, but you shouldn't have done this. This should have been, the community should do it. A rabbi should not be involved in this type of thing. Where the implication is that rabbanim shouldn't be involved in this type of what we'll call a dirty business of handing over one to save others. So yeah, that's the halacha, but you shouldn't have been involved. So Rambam saw this, and Rambam says, oh, so if a rabbi shouldn't be involved, then that means if they come to ask the Rav, what should he say? He should say, I'm not getting involved. So that's why the Rambam said, this is the best bet for what the Rambam was trying to say over here, which poses a problem. Because they're coming to the Bach, and they're asking the Bach for a psak. So does the Bach need to now say, no psak being given? And by the way, it could be, we don't know, it could be there's another Rav who's writing to the Bach, and the Bach is guiding this other Rav what to do. In which case the Bach now would need to say, don't give a psak. So that's the next challenge that the Bach is going to face. And what does he do? He's going to give you his third chiddush. And what he's going to basically tell you is that this detail of is not something we need to be worried about in this case. Now I should say before we get into the larger point, that he also makes this point briefly. That is, if you look, interestingly, the Ramah doesn't bring this. So you could actually make the case and say that it's not le'ilchaso. Like, what forced the Rambam to follow this Yerushalmi and to codify it into the Mishnah Torah? The Ramah didn't, so maybe we could ignore this entirely. But at the end of the day, people aren't really comfortable, especially with dinei nefashos, to ignore Rambam. And so rather than just doing that, he also spends time explaining why he doesn't think that's a problem in this case. Behektim, he introduces another problem. And that brings us to this Bereishis Rabbah, Parshat Tzadik Dalid, which again, it's very similar. The Bereishis Rabbah Tzadik Dalid is very similar to the Yerushalmi, where it discusses all these issues. And it says a similar story. What's the story? When Nebuchadnezzar came to Eretz Yisrael to conquer and to take Yehoyakim. He's the third to last king. The Churban happened during the time of Tzidkiyahu. Before Tzidkiyahu was Yechanya. Before Yechanya was Yehoyakim. But Yehoyakim was supposed to be a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar. At a certain point he rebelled. The Pasuk in Divrei Hayamim describes how Nebuchadnezzar came to take him. So Nebuchadnezzar was remaining in Antochia. Antakya is a place in Turkey today. In English is known as Antioch. So it's in the area in Turkey that's not much close to the north of Eretz Yisrael, and that's where Nebuchadnezzar was. So Yarda Sanhedrin Gedolei Likrasei. So the Sanhedrin descended, meaning they left Eretz Yisrael to go discuss the matzav with Nebuchadnezzar. Amrulai, they asked Nebuchadnezzar, did the time of the Churban come? In other words, do you have intentions to destroy the Beis Hamikdash? He said no, that was going to happen later. Ella, rather, what do I want? Yehoyakim melech Yehuda Maradbi. Yehoyakim has rebelled. Tnu oisayli, hand him over. Vani elech, then I'll leave you guys alone. So Azlun va'amrin Yehoyakim, they came to Yehoyakim and they said, Nebuchadnezzar ba'olach, Nebuchadnezzar wants you. Amar lahu. So he responded and said, this is what we're going to do. You're going to give up on my life for other lives. Now, even though he's one person and Eretz Yisrael is many thousands of people, but still, remember, in halacha, it doesn't work like that. We saw. Give over one, otherwise we kill everyone. We're not allowed to. So that's what he's saying. Are you going to give me over to save everyone else? But he said another thing. Doesn't it say, don't return a slave to his master? This is a very interesting second point that he says, and we'll see more why he's adding this in a second. But what is the point? The point is, you have this pasuk that says that you're not allowed to return a slave to his master. Chazal explain and limit the application of this rule. The Gemara in Gittin says it's referring to a non-Jewish slave who is owned by a Jewish master in Chutz La'aretz, a regular Eved Knani. Eved Knani is owned by a Jewish master in Chutz La'aretz. He runs away, comes to Eretz Yisrael. He's coming to Eretz Yisrael, and he wants to basically convert and become a full Jew. You need to allow him to do so. You're not allowed to send him back to Chutz La'aretz to live under the Adain. So it's a very narrow application of what this commandment is. This is how the Rambam explains it as well. Yehoyakim is using it in a much broader way. Like, don't return as slaves. Like I rebelled from Nebuchadnezzar. Don't give me over to Nebuchadnezzar. Almost as if this mitzvah is don't return a Jewish slave to a non-Jewish master, which again, maybe some of the Pashtanim learn it that way, that I don't know, but it's not the halachic way. Fine. So he has a broader way of understanding this pasuk. Don't turn me over to the master. Amruloi, so they said, and what did your grandfather do to Shavim ben Bichri? David really was Yoav, but Yoav was going b'shlichus David HaMelech. And what did he do? They handed over, they didn't hand over. They demanded that Shavim ben Bichri be handed over. So if your grandfather demanded that Shavim ben Bichri be handed over, so then we could demand that you be handed over as well. But he doesn't listen. Kivin shaloi shamalem, he doesn't listen. Amdu and Talu, the Sanhedrin took him. Vishul shalu aisai, and they lowered him down outside the siege. And then the Medrash uses a word that's not entirely clear what it means, but the Mefarshim assume it means in one way or another he was killed. This is what this Medrash is saying, and right away you see the problem. The problem is, if Rambam is right, that Mishnas Chasidim, the din is the din, but rabbanim and rabbis shouldn't be involved in this. Well, here you see rabbanim, the Sanhedrin, whose hands are involved in handing someone. So you can tell me, yeah, but it's Reish Lakish, because was Yaakam Chayev Misa b'dinei hagoyim? Yeah, he was Chayev Misa b'dinei hagoyim. He did the action that triggered, it's his fault, and all of that, 100%. And he's being labeled and called out 100%. But at the end of the day, Rambam told you, Midas Chasidus is rabbanim shouldn't have their hands involved. And here you see rabbanim had their hands involved in this. Elamai. What's the answer? So the answer is, the Bach suggests, I'll summarize the point outside. He suggests that there's a major difference between the Yehoyakim case and the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi case. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi case is where, yeah, it was the right thing for him to be handed over to the Romans, but you shouldn't have been involved, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Yehoyakim case is where the Sanhedrin did that. What's the difference between the two cases? It was very clear in the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi case, where they said, hand him over so that we can kill him. Hand him over so that we can kill him. When it's hand him over so that we can kill him, and it's not bidin Torah, it's just because it's your responsibility and it's bidin agoyim. So if you have those two things, if it's not dinei Torah, number one, and number two, if it's 100% clear that they intend to kill, then you turn to the rabbi and you say, let the Balabatim handle this, and you don't say anything. You ain't moed and Cain, and definitely don't be involved in it. However, he says, if it's not entirely clear what their intention is, what the non-Jew's intention is, we're going to take him, we're going to incarcerate him, maybe we'll do this, it's not entirely clear, right? It's not when you make an ultimatum and you say hand over your leader. It's not, you don't always know what's going to happen. Sometimes captive kings have been held for many years in exile. So when it's not entirely clear, so then this concern, what's the concern? That the Rabbanim's hands were dirty in the thing, it's less direct. Because it's less direct, so therefore we don't need to worry about it. That explains why the Sanhedrin were able to hand over Yehoyakim directly. Nebuchadnezzar at no point said, by the way, if you give him to me, I'm going to be killing him. And so therefore, the issue of the Midas Chasidis didn't apply over here. This is how the Bach explains this issue. Another way of saying it is, the Bach would tell you there's two scenarios where Midas Chasidus is not a concern. Two areas. One is if the person is Chayiv Misa Midin Torah. If the person is Chayiv Misa Midin Torah, then of course a Rav should be involved. What's a Rav's job on earth? A Rav's job on earth is to execute Dinei Torah. Sanhedrin does that type of stuff. They execute people. So if it's Din Torah Mamish, then this whole concern is not there. The other thing is, even if it's not din Torah, but if it isn't 100%, it doesn't use percentages, but if it isn't a clear situation of that they're going to put this guy to death, then this doesn't apply, and that becomes the third chiddush of the Bach. So to summarize, there's three chiddushim. Yes, you paskin like Reish Lakish, and yes, even that ain't moirin kain. But chiddush number one, it does not need to be chiv misamid in Torah. Chiddush number two, even if this person is currently outside the sakana. And chiddush number three is that the Midas Chasidis concept does not apply if it isn't a definite situation where we're for sure going to kill this guy. Which leads us now to the concluding passage where the Bach sums up, therefore, what his maskana is. Uvenida didan in our case, the Efsher Shadas Hasan and Levar al Aben Hametz. It's very possible that these ministers in Kalish, all they want to do is find out what happened. Does he indeed have this sacred object? That's why they're asking him to come to judgment. They want to interrogate him. Inami, another possibility, their position is this, whether he's going to come or not, is going to indicate whether he's guilty or not. If he's taka chayiv, in other words, if he has that object, then lo yaveh lemishpat man yasham, then he's taka not going to want to come. But im zakayu, if he has nothing to, if he's really innocent, then lo yira libay v'yaveh lemishpat. He's getting here, then he's not going to be afraid. He's giving here possibilities of why it's very possible this guy is not going to be killed. They're not asking him of him. They're not asking him so that they can get him to kill him. Because he caused the problem by accepting this purse. So he's the one who caused that they should want him. So then, we are not violating the Mishnah's Chsidim, biyadam, handing him over, handing him over for this judgment. And so therefore, he basically is telling you that this is going to be mutter. But there's a but, an important but. What if this guy, we need to know the truth. What if this shamish, the father-in-law, actually didn't receive the purse? What if they're just saying that he did? So that little detail makes all the difference. Why? Because if ish achar kibla, if someone else is the one that took it, aser lanu klal lefayis l'shamish ulaskika lava the mishpat, then forget about handing him over. You're not allowed to even go to him and try to convince him that he should be handed over. Why? Because the whole yesod of why this is mutter is your fault. You did something that triggered this, that was irresponsible, whatever. But if he didn't do it, then he didn't cause anything to be obligated to appear in front of them lemishpat. And so therefore you really need to know. We need to find out what the truth is. Did he actually receive this purse or not? If he did, we can hand him over. And he concludes, Hanira lefi aniyas daiti. This is what I think is the correct ruling. Kasafti v'chasamti. I'm writing and signing Shmiya Katan Yoel. My name is Yoel Sirkish. Then it says the following Rosh Tevis, which would appear to be the following: Aleph, Sunday. Ches lemispar b'nei Yisrael, the 8th for the counting of the Jewish people in the desert, that is Sfiras Omer. During this time and even later, even till today, there are some people during Sfiras Omer will indicate the day by writing this Lamed Mem Beis Yud lemispar b'nei Yisrael, referring to b'nei Yisrael in the desert. Now, if this is right, so then Ches lemispar b'nei Yisrael is Isru Chag, so it's right after Pesach. Shin Pei, 1620, Leprat Katan, Poi Kilik Deutsche Krakow. This is the ruling of the Bach. And now what I want to do is I want to show you two cases in where the Bach's psak was relied on in subsequent generations, where other rabbanim quoted him and relied on him here. But here I want to point out something. This sugya of Tnu Lanu Achas Mikan, you can literally do an entire book if you wanted to quote what the great poskim and lesser known poskim said about this subject. You could literally put together a 600-page book on this issue. So much has been said. But when I was preparing this year, I said, you know what? I want to focus specifically on real cases that happen. What was the psak din? Not when someone was sitting in a study of what should Allah Habir, Rabbi Yechon, Reish Lakish in an academic sense. I think there's great value to know how these cases worked out when there was actually some people's lives really on the line. Because I think that when the stakes are higher at that level, besides for being more interesting, I think it brings something to the table that you don't get when you're just reading it off of an Acharon or a Rishon, for that matter, who was writing in a more theoretical way. And so there aren't so many tshuvas that I know of that really get into the heart of these issues. But there's another two that are really important, and that's what we're going to turn now. And as we're going to see, they're relying on the Bach. So we turn to a work that was produced in the 1600s on Shulchan Aruch that's called the Beis Hillel. The Beis Hillel was authored by a Rav whose name was Rab Hillel ben Naftali Hertz, and for his last rabbinic position was in Zalkova. Zalkova is in Poland, in Galicia, and it appears to me that he was in Zalkova at the time of this writing, and let's read the case. So this is actually not a Shaila V'Tshuva. This is a halacha sefer. It's a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, but he goes off script here to say a real case that happened with him. Nishalti, I was asked b'psula achas about a girl. Shahaya etzel doida b'kal echad. She was by her uncle in one Jewish community. He doesn't name the community. Why was she by the uncle? Was she an orphan? I don't know, lacking the details. V'helil aleh akum echad, and a non-Jew libeled her, shehifticha oisoi, that she had promised him, shetavar al das Yehudis, that she will convert, v'liyas le'isha, and that she will marry him. So someone comes to the local Polish authorities and says, this Jewish girl promised me that we would marry and that she would convert. Now, if a man tells during this time, if a man says, like, my wife should convert, he has the right to impose that on her. And even in an engagement by Catholic law, there would be that ability to kind of impose that on a woman. So here he's saying, she promised to marry me, so essentially we're engaged. She also said that we're going to convert, and I want her to convert. So by Catholic law, they're looking into this thing in Poland. There's a very famous, somewhat famous case that happened later in 1793 in Italy of a girl whose name was Anne Del Monte. Anne Del Monte wrote a diary. What was the story? Very similar here, where basically in that case it was a boy who grew up Jewish, converted to Christianity, and then he went to the authorities and said, she had told me, she was from a very chashva family, and in the Roman Jewish community in Rome, and he tells them, she promised me, or she told me that she wants to convert, and we're engaged, that type of thing, and she wants to convert. The problem was there wasn't evidence that they were actually engaged. But what happened was, because of the Roman authorities are very, they can do whatever they want. They arrested this woman, Anne, and she was incarcerated for 22 days. If I recall correctly, why do we know this? She wrote a diary. So it's a really interesting diary about those 22 days that she went through. And every day, the visits, and the threats, and the blackmail, and I don't recall any physical torture, maybe lack of sleep, but I don't call any like beatings or anything like that. But still, when you read it, you're like, it feels like a ton of bricks just landing on your head, feeling what she was going through. But it's that same type of idea over here where I don't have full clarity on exactly all the details how it worked, but this was a problem the Jewish community was facing, because people come along and say that, and then by Catholic law, what do you mean? This person, there's another element here. If there's a Jew who wants to convert and they're not being allowed to by their surroundings, and that's a big problem, then we also have a right to come in and work that out. So for these reasons, this stuff happens from time to time, and that's what's happening over here. So what does the uncle do? I'll summarize now outside. The uncle does is he finds out what happens to this libel was said against his niece. So he sends her away to another community, and he clarifies it's under another Tsar. It's Poland, so it's different parts. Different lord. He, in each one of these places is pretty independent, and he sends her to a different kehillah. He doesn't name the kehillah. When the first community notices what happens, when the Christian boy realized what happens, he went to his local parets, who proceeded to arrest the rabbi in community 1 and the kol, which means the Rashi HaKol presumably, and they basically said, you hand over this girl for a mishpat, otherwise you guys are going to remain here, I guess. So the rabbi who's incarcerated and the community leaders, they sent to me, the Rabbi Reb Hillel ben Naftali Hertz. They sent to me, please send the girl. So in other words, Reb Hillel ben Naftali Hertz seems to have some shaykhs to this girl. Maybe the second community was Zalkova, where he was the rabbi, but I can't say that for sure. So that they can save themselves from being incarcerated. So he goes over to the girl, says, what happened? The girl says, B'mar nafsha, Salka b'mar nafsha. I never spoke to this guy about marriage. Never happened. Or conversion. Okay. So now Rabbi Hillel ben Naftali Hertz doesn't know what to do. He feels his question's a little bigger than him. So he sends to the great Bezdin in Brisk, which is in Lita. He's in Zalkova, which is in Galicia. So he sends to Brisk. He was originally from there, which would explain why he sends a shaila to there. They responded back, Ma noida asher lo teida. What do we know that you don't know? In other words, this is on you, figure this out. Why they respond that way? I don't know. Were they being like the Rambam, or like the Midas Chasidus, that you're not supposed to pass on? I don't know. Ma neida asher lo teida. What do we know that you don't know? You're on your own. He goes on to bring the Bach. Now here's important. he has the Bach. He doesn't have the tshuva of the Bach. He passed away before the first edition of Shuvas of the Bach. I said before, 1697. He passed away before that. He doesn't have the tshuva of the Bach. But what he does have is a commentary of the Bach to the Torah. And the commentary on the Bach to the Torah, the Bach basically writes the kitzer of his tshuva, but very, very bekitzer, like one paragraph, and he says, I was ma'arich in the tshuva, I'm not going to be ma'arich here, and he summarizes his main points. And so he quotes those main points. Specifically, 2 of the 3 chidushim, the Bach says over there. Chiddush number 1, even if you're passing like Reish Lakish, it doesn't need to be Chiyav Misa min HaTorah, it's enough if it's Chiyav Misa midineim. And number 2, if it's not certain that they're going to be killing the person, then there's not even a Midas Chasidus concern and you could hand the person over. That's what the Bach summary is over there, and he quotes it. And he says, over here, in our case, based on this Bach, it would be permissible to hand over this girl so that, why? Because we're not killing her. They're going to discuss with her. They're going to interrogate her. Even though it's possible that they're going to do an avla b'mishpat. What does that mean? Lahamid edim shkarim via kufu. Maybe they're going to have false witnesses who are going to say something like, you did say that. Or even if they'll say, by the way, we testify that you're engaged, that itself could be a problem. Alachas kama kama, if they testify that she said that. Or yakufu, maybe they're going to force her. So now you're reaching this terrible situation. Doesn't matter. You could still hand her over. Why? Because we're saving the larger group. We're saving the larger group. And again, it's not certain that they are going to, that they're going to actually harm her or do anything to her. They may actually let her go off once they finish their investigation. But then he goes, but hold on a second. And I realize, hold on. No. The Bach is talking about a case in where a person did something irresponsible. She's saying, I didn't do anything, it's irresponsible. Because the psula soyekes v'tzavachas umacheshes, she's denying, she's saying, I never said anything. So really, the flight didn't even get off the ground if you think about it. The first thing to make this enter the zone of possibility to hand over is you ask according to Reish Lakish. By the way, Rabbi Yochanan agrees to Reish Lakish's standard, so Rabbi Yochanan also has a different standard. Everyone agrees to Reish Lakish's standard, that if the person is Chayav Misa Kashav Ben Bichri, you hand that person over. In order for any possibility to even begin as a possibility, the person has to have done an act that warrants this type of jurisdiction, this type of prosecution. She's saying, I didn't do anything. And so therefore he says, really, this whole Bach doesn't apply. Now I want to point out, if he would have had the tshuva of the Bach, he wouldn't have written it this way, because the Bach said clearly at the end of his tshuva, you need to know, lechatchila, did the guy take the wallet or did he not take the wallet? The problem is he didn't have the tshuva of the Bach. Tshuva of the Bach wasn't printed. All he had was this little summary. And so therefore he's kind of working this out on his own in his head. And this detail that you actually need to know. So therefore he sets up the first thing and then he knocks it off saying, oh, I found a distinction. Whereas in the original tshuva of the Bach, the distinction is actually very clear there. So then he says, this turns into a separate halachic discussion. What's a separate discussion? Now, you can't use this Yerushalmi, Trumas, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish. The Rambam is completely irrelevant. This girl is saying, I didn't do anything wrong. If you want to follow that sugya, you can hand her over. However, there's another sugya. And that's the sugya of, is a person obligated to assume risk, perhaps even extreme risk, or for that matter, suffering and difficulty, in order to save other people? That's really what this shaila is. He then goes into discuss that, but the bottom line he says, and we're not going to get into that, he says, there is no obligation to assume risk in order to save other people, and so therefore, this woman should not be handed over. However, rabbis need to come up with solutions to problems. You have a problem over here. And the problem is that there are people who are languishing away in jail. So you could just say, I did my job, sak din, we can't hand her over. But you understand, as they sometimes say, the fifth chelik in Shulchan Aruch. So he came up with a solution here. What did he do? He said, this woman does have an obligation. What's her obligation? There are people who are languishing in jail. She is here, let's say, assuming she's here now in Zalkava, you go over to the Paritz in Zalkava, and you testify in front of him. He's separate from the case. He describes this guy as also being less powerful, and maybe he was less radical. You go to him, you say. So now that guy is going to write up an affidavit. He's going to say, I looked into this matter and it never happened. He'll send it over to them and they'll get released. And that's what happened. He says that's what happened. She went over to the local paritz. She gave her testimony. Local paritz, it doesn't say this clearly, but presumably sent it over to the other place. But this was a psak din, and he said this woman has the obligation. Why? Because someone else is languishing away, and there's something you could do. And there isn't. He didn't feel that this was an unreasonable level of risk to go to the local parts. To go there would have been, but locally not. And this was the psak din that Reb Hillel. Right? Reb Hillel ben Naftali gave in that case, quoted again in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch Yeridei Kuf Nun Zayin. What do you see? You see him using the exact same model that the Bach was using. And lastly, we have another tshuva that quotes both of these, both the tshuva of the Bach as well as the tshuva of the Beis Hillel, because this is from the next century, from a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yishmael HaKohen of Madina. Rabbi Yishmael HaKohen of Madina lived the 1700s mostly, passed away in the early 1800s. And his Shilas HaTshuvos is known as Zera Emes. And in Chelik Beis, Siman Nun Aleph, he tells us the following story. And you'll see there's some similarities to the story we just saw from the Beis Hillel. Ma'aseh Haya, there's a story of a Bachar Echad, Asher Avra Olav Ruach Ra, that a negative spirit overtook him. V'hesisosai ruach znunim bikirboy, and then a spirit of znus overcame him. Liten ena bebask el nerchar, and now he's interested in a non-Jewish girl. Achan asan aleh nafsha, and he gave her his soul. V'ifticha lahamer das, and he told her, I am going to convert. But v'kasav b'sefer v'chasum l'kaim aftachasei. This was notarized. So they got this notarized that he says he's basically converting. When his father heard about a davar hara, he wants to save his son, so he sends him to another city. Presumably this is happening somewhere in the Italian peninsula. He sends him to another city where you don't have the shmad so much. We know Rome was a terrible place, for example. Other places were less radical. He sends him to another place. Because in this other place they ask once, do you want to convert? And if you say no, they let you go. Mashen came be'iroi in his city. Like Rome, I showed you before. They took this lady away for 22 days. Okay. So now what do the local authorities do? They take the father and they threaten him and they say, we're going to torture you if you don't bring us your son back. So now he wants to know, what is the din? Am I allowed to basically, bring my son back? It's interesting. What does his son want to do? Does his son want to come back or not? That's not clear in this story. But am I allowed to basically disclose where my son is, or bring him back, or get him to come back, or not? And he brings this Beis Hillel, and he says, he's mafalpo. It's a long tshuva. But the main point is, he says, halacha is like this Beis Hillel that we just saw, which is the same thing, which is the Bach. That what? The key question is, if you did something that was reckless, A, and based on secular law, you therefore need to do something else. So that is exactly what happened in this case. This kid did something, yes. Based on their laws, something needs to happen that he needs to go to them? Yes, that's what their laws say. So then, according to the din, we're allowed to hand over that person. This case is not to save a group, but it's to save me from torture. This was the psak din that Rabbi Yishmael HaKohen of Madina gave. He then tells us an interesting detail that eventually this went in court, and the court ruled, okay, we're not going to torture the father, but there's going to be a financial penalty. So now it changes to a whole new analysis. Do I need to suffer a financial penalty in order to avoid sending my son in? What a tragic life. What a tragic question. All of this is tragic. But that element of the tshuva, we're not going to get into that question. I'll just tell you that at the end he's matir. And he's essentially matir in this case to have this kid turned over to these authorities to make the investigation that they're going to be making. And remember, it rests on these pillars of the Bach. Number one, lav dafka, right? The guy has a chance to walk away free. It's not a certain death sentence, begashmias or beruchnias of conversion. And the person is responsible. He did something. And the other element, and now he's outside the sakana. Yeah, but we don't care. You're outside the sakana. We don't care if, again, you are at fault. Okay, so that's an overview of the 3 tshuvas where this issue came up. In all of them, the answer was there was a heter, right? Except for that middle case where there wasn't a heter, but at the end of the day, they still figured out a solution. So in all cases, some solution was the result. I want to use the final few minutes of the shir to discuss a few sources where the Rebbe discussed this din. Behektem, I want to point out that the Rebbe discussed certain sugyas very often and came back to them again and again, whether it was in a Rashi or a Rambam or even Chassidus. And one of these sugyas that the Rebbe comes back to a lot is a sugya of the relationship between the individual and the community. In halachic language, is Yachid and the Tzibur. There's a lot of material from the Rebbe on this. In one of the places where the Rebbe is discussing Korban Pesach and Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, which we're not going to get into the details right now, the Rebbe points out in Lakut Sichos Chelik Yud Ches, he quotes this din, that you're not allowed to hand over one to save a group. Of course, there are exceptions, but there are also instances where this is not allowed. And he says, what does that show you? That the tzibur cannot be machriya the yachid. The tzibur cannot cancel the individual. That although the tzibur is machriya yachid, so what that means is, in a very simple sense, if 10 people are going to vote one way and one person is going to vote another way, Torah recognizes that. And so in that sense, the tzibur overrides the yachid, so that we do say, but can it's aber nit mevatel sein de mitzius von yachid. It doesn't have the ability to cancel. You can override, a community can override an individual, cannot cancel an individual. He's saying this to explain this din that we can't hand over one because that one is going to be canceled because it's going to be killed, that the community's rights don't extend so far. It's interesting. Community rights go so far that you could override, fine, but not cancel. And by the way, this helps explain, not that the Rebbe does this, but I'm saying this on my own, the heter of the Bach that, if it's not for sure that he's being killed, if there's other possibilities, so then the din changes, and that kind of makes sense. Because now you're not canceling. You're overriding, it's more difficult for this person, but at the end of the day, it's not a cancel. The key over here is that the individual can never be canceled, even as they can be overridden. So that's one point that he makes in that sikha. That's, I would say, more in language of Nigla. In the Sikha, in Lakut Sichos Chelik Lamed, page 154, the Rebbe discusses this concept in the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus. And using the language of the Alter Rebbe and from the Arizal, that a Jewish soul is a Chelek Alikam Imal, and there's this concept of the soul being the essence of Hashem, and if you have the essence of Hashem, then you have everything. In other words, there can't be anything more than that. So, when we think about it in our terms, obviously, you have 1, and then 2 is more, and 3 is more, and 4 is even more. But if you have the etzem of Hashem, then the etzem of Hashem encompasses everything. So once you have that, you have everything. So all of a sudden, 1 yid, so you're like, yeah, but I have 10, and 10 is more than 1. No, once I have 1, that's everything. So this is abstract spiritual language that the Rebbe uses in that sikha to explain this idea, like, why would we not want to save 10 instead of 1? And the answer would be 10 and 1? What do you mean? It's all the same thing. They have that same neshama, that same soul, and once you have that, you have everything, and there is no such a thing as more than that. There's no such a thing as being more valuable than that. That's kind of the language that the Rebbe uses over there. However, at the end of the day, there needs to be some explanation because sometimes we do hand over 1 to save others. So how do we work with this? So this brings us, and this will be the final piece that we do, to the Shema. The Rebbe in 1944 went to a wedding, and before the Rebbe would go to, or after, the Rebbe would often prepare something to say. This wedding was dated was on Yud Aleph Tammuz Tafshin Dalid, and the Rebbe wrote Lamed Nun by this Rishim, which means Lo Namar, which means he wasn't asked to speak, and so he didn't say this piece. What's the piece? So the Rebbe brings this din that you can't hand over 1 to save the group. The Rebbe brings from the Eitz Chaim, from the Arizal, about the sparks in the Jewish soul and how there's no difference then between one Jew and another, even though one is smarter and one is less smart. It doesn't matter. Mitzad the nitzvahs of the neshama, everyone is the same. And then takes the next step. And therefore there's no difference between one and a group. It's all the same. Once you have the neshama, you have everything. But yet the Rebbe points out, the reality is that we have this pasuk in Torah, Achrei Rabbim Lahatos. And Achrei Rabbim Lahatos means that you have 3 judges, you follow the 2, not the 1. Which means that Torah does value 2 more than 1. So what's going on over here? The Rebbe explains that what it says in Kabbalah and Chassidus is a deep truth that transcends Seichel. But Torah also needs to come down into Seichel. And when Torah comes down into Seichel, there is distinction. And there is a maila of one person over another person. There are many dinim in Torah that reflect that one person's a king and one person's not a king, that one person's a chacham, another person is not a chacham. Why? Because that is Seichel. Torah can't be aloof and abstract from Seichel, has to come into that world as well, which is why many Torah laws have that recognition. However, Ratzu b'din echad, the Rebbe said. In one law, we wanted to teach you that very, very deep abstract truth where Torah is before it came down into Seichel, where over there on that level, there is no difference between one and another, and there is no difference between a group and an individual. And so we needed just a reminder of this. That's all we needed. This is not going to be the normal operational principle in Judaism. But I need you to know it. And I need you to know it in a halacha. So I have one halacha. The Rebbe brings an example that when you have an Eruv in the city, you need to have one shchuna that doesn't have an Eruv. Why? Just so people remember the din that you're not allowed to carry without an Eruv. So similarly, although Torah came down into Seichel, so therefore many of the Torah halachas recognize distinctions and differences between Jews, which amongst them is that two is better than one. Acher rabbanim lahatois, and many halachas reflect that. We wanted one din that reflected this core spiritual idea that once you have an neshama, you have everything, and therefore there's no difference between one and the others. And that's how the Rebbe explains this reality that we have, where on the one hand, we have this din, we're not going to sacrifice, you can't sacrifice one to save the group. That's there to tell you a deep truth, but it's not going to encompass everything, including in this sugya itself, where there are cases where the person could be handed over, as we saw in these tshuvas. The Rebbe then goes on to add one other point, because let's remember, this is during World War II, it's 1944. The Rebbe says, this is a difference between Jews and non-Jews. In other words, the Rebbe is pointing out that definitely in the ancient world, and even in the modern world, Judaism has much more of an individual-based jurisprudence than non-Jews. The Rebbe continues and says, the truth is that amongst non-Jews themselves, in the current war, World War II right now, there's a big distinction and difference between the two sides that are at battle during World War II. One view, which is the fascist view, the Rebbe summarized, says, Hayochid ayin, the individual doesn't exist, Hamlucha hakol, and the government is everything. So there is a philosophy of government that's called fascism, but it was developed before Hitler, and it is take the killings and the persecution out, just go to what the fascist ideology is. The fascist ideology is the individual doesn't exist. Mussolini has this famous line, everything by the state, for the state, in the state. That's what the Rebbe is summarizing here. Hayochid ayin, hamlucha akol. The yachid doesn't exist. The hamlucha is everything. So that reflects the non-Torah perspective. There's only a tzibur, there is no yachid. A yachid only matters to the degree that he contributes to the tzibur, but as an individual, the yachid doesn't matter. But in Yiddishkeit, the Rebbe doesn't finish the thought, but the point is that the other Ummas Ha'olam during World War II are democracies. And democracies have a little more of this concept of individual rights, where although theoretically it could be better if, let's say, we didn't allow certain people to speak, no, but there's individual rights, and so therefore they're going to have some freedom of speech, etc. So the Rebbe is saying that this is a distinction between Torah and Ummas Ha'olam, but amongst Ummas Ha'olam there's a distinction between the two forces that are fighting at this point. And I guess we'll conclude with that will be the conclusion for this topic. And obviously, truth is, any person that's involved in a family or in a classroom or in a shul, there's always a discussion of there's individuals, there's groups. It's not easy dealing with both or having the right balance of tending to both in the proper way. So that's, if you're looking for an element of avodah for this, is to remember this idea that even as we worry about the group, but you can't also, Torah teaches us to remind us that we don't forget about the individual.